If you have been learning Japanese, or if you have been paying attention while reading the subtitles while watching anime, you probably know that Japanese has way more pronouns than English does. I have two videos about personal pronouns, I, me, and then about pronouns for you. But in this video, I wanted to bring everything together and talk about how I, as a translator, translate all those differences between all of the pronouns. So the first issue is, how do I translate the difference between if a character is using a pronoun like boku or ore written with kanji versus boku or ore written in katakana? So if you read Japanese manga at all, you have probably noticed that some characters use ore or boku or those pronouns, and there's kanji or maybe hiragana for those pronouns. And then some other characters use katakana with those pronouns. And you might be wondering, well, what's the difference? Why is it in kanji for some of the characters and in katakana for some of the other characters? Sometimes there's a very simple reason, and it is simply because you don't always know who is speaking in manga. You don't always see their faces in the frames. Sometimes you have isolated speech bubbles. So it's just really helpful to very clearly differentiate between the characters. So it's like, okay, well, this character uses atashi, this character uses watashi, this character uses ore in kanji, this character uses ore in katakana, this character uses boku, this character uses an archaic pronoun oira, which people usually don't use, but it's a manga character, so he can use it. That's one very simple reason why they do this with manga characters. Sometimes it's just so you can tell the difference between the characters. It's as simple as that. But there's a little bit more to it than that. Usually if a word is in katakana when it's not supposed to be in katakana, like it's not a borrowed word, it's definitely a Japanese word, and yet they put it in katakana anyway, it can either be because they want to emphasize the word, or because the character is a foreigner and they're not necessarily going to pronounce all of the words properly, so it's kind of to note, well, this word, this character doesn't really pronounce quite right. But the third reason is if that word is a little bit unnatural or a little bit forced. So if a character is using katakana ore or katakana boku, it means that that character isn't quite the kind of character who should be using those pronouns specifically, but he's kind of forcing it. It's like, I'm not really the kind of guy who'd use ore, but I want to sound like a tough guy, so I'm going to use ore. Or, I'm not really like a girly girl, but I kind of want to fit in and be a girly girl, so I'm going to use atashi. It can mean that as well. So how I would translate that is, you can't show it in personal pronoun choices really in English because we don't have that many pronouns. Now we are creating more and more pronouns for various genders, which are coming into our discourse. But as far as levels of toughness or softness or whatever, we don't exactly have those pronouns, and they're not mainstream or well known by all. So what you have to do as a translator is just consider all of the words that character speaks. It's like, okay, well, this is the kind of character who uses a katakana ore, so he's kind of trying to act tougher than he actually is. So I would kind of force some slang in there. I'd force some rough dialogue in there. I'd have some out of place rough slang, like, oh man, me and my brother fight like heck. Something like he's trying to sound tough, but he's just failing because he's obviously not that tough. You have to just find very subtle ways of working that into everything else that the character says. You can't just rely on, well, this character uses this pronoun written in katakana, and just by that fact alone, you know a lot about this character. No, you have to reveal it throughout the rest of the dialogue, which will be somewhat evident anyway in the original Japanese. The second consideration is, how do I show the difference between maybe a man that uses watashi versus a man that uses ore? So as I explained in the personal pronouns video, if you were a man that uses watashi, you're pretty much only using that if you're higher class, or if you're delivering a speech, or just if you're being rather formal in general. And if you use ore, you're being more casual and just a man, and not a softer man, but just a man. And again, that is going to come out in the rest of that man's dialogue. If it's a guy who says ore, I'm going to make that dialogue more natural sounding, I'd say, because ore is your general default male personal pronoun. So a character who uses ore in kanji I would just translate him rather straight up, just as a very typical guy. But if it's a guy who uses watashi, he probably already is like a guy who wears a suit and glasses. He's like very, very like to the book and just very proper and or rich. So I would have that character use more advanced vocabulary. I would have that character do things like not put prepositions at the end of sentences. I would just take extra care to make sure that that character speaks in a more effective manner, in a more articulate manner, and also in a more formal manner. I would never have that character use slang or swearing unless that character was like definitely using slang or swearing. A third thing to consider is sometimes you might have noticed this in anime. A character starts saying something like, "Ore wa janakute watashi wa," and then he'll finish the sentence. Or "Boku wa janakute ore wa," and then they'll keep going. Or "Atashi wa janakute watashi wa." You may have noticed this, and this is something that really bothers me when I see it in subtitles because it's almost always done incorrectly. So the incorrect way to translate that, what you absolutely should not do, is be like, "I ... that is I ... or I ... I mean I ... because it's absolutely meaningless in English. It's like a person saying, I mean, I. It's like, it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever that this character would be, just kidding, It's like you're stopping yourself, correcting yourself, and then saying the exact same thing that you said before. So no, what you should do in that instance, I do either one of two things. One, if it is purely written text, which is mostly what I deal with since I deal with games, if I have an opportunity where the character is starting the sentence with slang or profanity and then corrects him or herself and switches up to a more formal tone, because that's what's happening there, I'll do that. I might, if the character was asking a question, so let's say that what he was going to say was, "Ore wa nani yatten da?" Let's say that's what he was going to say, but he catches himself like, wait, I have to be polite, and he's like, "Ore wa janakute, watashi wa nani o sureba ii desu ka?" and changes it. So he's changing it to like a completely, he was going to say something kind of rude, and he's just rephrasing it in a polite way. So I would translate something like that as, "What the hell? I mean, what should I do?" So you have to just ignore the fact that he was changing pronouns, because we don't do that in English, and just basically think of the rude version of what he was going to say, and then think of the polite version of what he was going to say, and then see if you can word it in such a way that sounds natural, where you're starting the rude sentence rudely and it's clearly rude so that you can correct it, and then start the polite sentence politely. And if you can't do that and make it sound natural, and if it's just written and no one knows that he started the sentence and then trailed off and then restarted it again, I just completely omit it. I just translate it just as the polite version of the sentence, because otherwise it's really clunky. If it's anime though, and you can hear that the character was like gonna say something and then like cuts himself off and then picks up again, you can usually hear the difference in the tone of voice, and you know something was up, so it's a little weird if you just translate it straight up as the polite version of what he was saying. So in that case, even if it sounds slightly unnatural, I will try to force, okay, well, I'm going to start the rude version of the sentence, then I'm going to cut off, and then I'm going to pick up with, well, this is the polite version of the sentence. But under no circumstances should you ever subtitle it as I mean, it just makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Another issue to deal with is, what if the character in question uses his or her own name in place of a personal pronoun? Now, I mentioned in the I and you personal pronoun videos that often a name is used in place of I or you. In fact, I'd say for you, names are a little more common than you pronouns, because you can be a little bit rude. Whereas with me, I pronouns, it's not as common to use your own name in place of I or me, but it's definitely a lot more common to do that in Japanese than it is in English. If Sarah uses her own name as a personal pronoun, Sarah sounds like a fucking idiot. So we don't want to do that in the translation so much either, unless the character is a really silly, bubbly, sing-songy kind of person who might in fact use her name as a personal pronoun. Even if that character is that kind of person who would use their own name as a personal pronoun, I avoid doing it 100% of the time, because it can get a little weird, it can get a little cluttered. and just be very distracting and unnatural. I try to instead incorporate that free-spiritedness, that silliness, that genkiness into the dialogue in other ways besides just using my name as my own personal pronoun. I will probably make that person's dialogue a little more innocent sounding, a little more childlike. Another thing to consider is, what do I do if a character uses archaic pronouns? I went over some of the more archaic pronouns in the I, me personal pronouns video, pronouns like shosei or sessha or ware. Now we do have like thee and thou in the English language, which is like really ancient you pronouns. So if the character might use thee and thou, I will have that character use thee and thou. If it's the kind of character that would use those very old, very regal personal pronouns. And otherwise, just like a character that uses watashi, I would take extra care to make that character's speech sound like a poem, sound like it was written by Shakespeare, sound like it was, you know, just very, very good English, okay? And so, yeah, when I do period pieces, I'm doing translating two period pieces right now. Well, one of them is like a pseudo period piece, the other one is a period piece. And those are definitely a lot more difficult because not only do they tend to have more Japanese vocabulary, like they won't have any borrowed words. So there's like a lot of Japanese words that I kind of don't know as well because they're just not used today. The borrowed words are used instead. That's one problem. But another problem is, yeah, you have these characters that are using these more archaic personal pronouns. And yeah, you have to just show that by, you know, reference any like older novels you've read. If it's, you know, 1800s, think about Jane Austen. Think about, if it's before that, think about Shakespeare. Think about more classic literature and try to emulate the speaking style that you'll find in those novels and in those movies or plays, anything that you've seen from that time period. Now, this next consideration actually was a question that came up from one of my viewers, and it was, what if gender-neutral pronouns are used when talking about other people? So what I didn't talk about in the other two videos yet are the pronouns for third parties. So if I'm talking about my sister and I say, oh, she is in third grade, I'll say, kanojo wa 3年生. If I want to use the she pronoun, I will say kanojo. Actually, I would say imoto wa 3年生 desu. I wouldn't necessarily say kanojo wa. Again, it's kind of rude to use pronouns. It's considered more polite to be a little more passive tense with your speech. So to say my little sister is in third grade instead of she is in third grade is a little softer and a little more polite. But yeah, if I were using a she pronoun, that would be kanojo. If it's my little brother, I would say kare wa 3年生. Those are just the two very basic she, her, he, him. There's no other pronouns that are gendered other than those that are used commonly. However, they also have anohito and anokata. So anohito is literally that person, but it doesn't have the same vibe as that person does in English. It is kind of similar to them and they in English. Whereas anokata is basically the very polite version of anohito. It means like that esteemed person. So this viewer gave me an example. There was a scene in an anime that they were watching, and one of the characters said, anokata te shiteiru, which literally means, do you know that person? Or do you know of that person? And the subtitle said, do you know him? Now the problem here was that it wasn't quite revealed yet in the anime and the scene who exactly they were talking about. And so by revealing the gender of who it was that they were talking about, they were already kind of revealing and hinting at who it could be that they were talking about, when in the original Japanese it was very vague because it was just anohito. Now I haven't seen the actual anime in question. Maybe it was more clear who they were talking about and it wasn't exactly wrong to translate it as him. But yeah, there are cases, plenty of cases, where a character will be referencing another character that hasn't come on yet, and they'll say something very vague like anohito or anokata, and I have to make a choice. What pronoun am I going to use? I could do the gender neutral and say, do you know them? And that actually works. It's becoming much more common nowadays for people to use they and them as a gender neutral singular pronoun in the English language. So that is actually a pretty good default, because it sounds very strange if we say, do you know that person? You could say something like, do you know who I'm talking about? Or do you know who I'm referencing? You could say something like that, depending on the context. But yeah, I would avoid using he or her, like very definite gendered pronouns in this case, because yeah, we don't want to necessarily reveal to the audience any information about this person if this person is supposed to say a mystery. And we also don't want to like guess and assume that it's a character that happens to be male and then it turns out to be a character that's a female, because then that's just a complete mistranslation. And this is one of the reasons why I really like watching an anime series through to like the very end before I start translating it, and why I feel like ultimately simulcast anime is going to be much inferior to translating anime after the whole thing is done, because then you can pick up on little tiny things like that and take into account, oh, it's revealed 3 episodes later that they were talking about this person. Okay, hi, Sarah from the future here. As I was editing that video together, I realized that I made a big mistake and I left out aitsu out of the pronouns. So aitsu is a perfect example of a gender-neutral singular pronoun. Yes, Japanese has a gender-neutral singular pronoun. In English, we have they, which we sometimes use as a singular pronoun, but it's confusing because it's also a plural gender-neutral pronoun. But they have aitsu. The problem with aitsu, however, is that it is rude. It can kind of be endearing, like if I'm talking about my cat and I call her or him aitsu. It's like, little shithead. It's like, but it's an endearing term. It's not necessarily as rude as calling someone a shithead. So if I come across aitsu in a translation, I'll usually just translate it as him or her if we know who this character is talking about, and if we know that character's gender that the character is talking about, I'll just say him or her, sometimes that guy or that girl or that stupid guy or that stupid girl, because it kind of has that, that damn girl, that damn guy. It has that feeling to it. But if a character is referencing a character that we don't know who they're talking about yet, and we don't know that character's gender, sometimes we'll translate it as that idiot, because it does have that rudeness to it, or that little devil or something, or that brat, so that I can keep the gender ambiguous. Translating it as them to remain gender neutral isn't as good to do with aitsu, just because them is a little, it's a little distancing if you're using them as a gender neutral singular pronoun for a person we haven't met yet. Whereas aitsu kind of reveals something about how that character feels about that other character. It just sounds a little unnatural to translate it as them or they in that instance. So the same viewer also brought up another point, that sometimes in anime, often in anime, there's a lot of gender bending characters in anime. Often you'll have a character who's, biologically male, might even identify as male, but dresses as, wears skirts, wears women's clothing, presents female, and then people use female pronouns with this character, but it's later revealed that that character is indeed male, or vice versa. But sometimes, maybe the other characters don't know yet about this character's like real sex, but the subtitles are already giving away the character's true sex. This is a touchy subject, and also kind of a confusing subject, because it's not always clear in anime what a character's gender is. Trans visibility has blown up in American culture, and enby visibility has blown up in American culture, but in Japanese culture, they're still kind of lagging. Characters that gender bend in anime aren't necessarily trans. They're not necessarily enby. They're not necessarily like realistic, if that makes any sense. Often it's just a device, like, ooh, ha ha ha, that character looks like a girl, but he's actually a boy, psych. It's not actually that character that is like that, but it's more just a tertiary, haha funny thing that's happening in the series. And you don't always know, actually, if that character really identifies as the gender that they're presenting as, or if they identify as their biological sex. You don't know sometimes. So in those cases, it's best to just go with whatever pronouns everyone else is using. And if they're using gender-neutral pronouns, you try to use passive tense as much as possible in your translations so you can avoid pronouns altogether. Or if you have to use pronouns, use they, them, until something is more established. That's really the best that you can do. And if the characters think that this biological male who's presenting female, if the characters around this character think that that character is female, then those characters should indeed be using the she, her pronouns, even if that character does not identify as female. If the point in the story is that the other characters think that that character is female, then yeah, they should be going ahead and using the she, her pronouns until they find out, oh, it's a dude. That's one point. Another point, though, is, as I mentioned before, these characters aren't always necessarily trans, they're not necessarily enby, but sometimes they are. And then you run into another set of problems because inevitably there's one or two transphobic, homophobic characters in the series that will insist on dead naming or using the wrong pronouns for that character. And I came across this problem once in a game I was translating. There was a character who was definitely trans. I mean, you could question it just a little bit. I mean, she never said, I am trans, but she picked a feminine name for herself. She used, you know, the feminine I pronouns with herself. She used atashi. Her closest friends used she, her pronouns with her and referred to her as a woman. So you can basically assume more or less that this character is trans, even though she never explicitly said in the dialogue, I am trans. Like no one else said that. You can pretty much assume she's trans, and yet there were two transphobic male characters in the series that were squeamish, and they would sometimes dead name her and sometimes use male pronouns with her. And like I said, if it were a little ambiguous of is this character really trans? Is this character really not trans, then I might let that slide. But this character even corrected them a couple times, like, hitoi wa, like my name is this feminine name. It's not that my dead name that you're calling me by. And on the one hand, if a character is transphobic, to not translate him as transphobic would be censorship, and it would be not true to that character. It's like, if there's a transphobic character, he should be translated as a transphobic character. Unfortunately, though, these transphobic characters were like love interests. It's an otome game, so like you're dating many different guys in different story arcs. And these two guys, like, you're the main character and you're dating them, you're in a relationship with them and you love them. And it's uncomfortable that they would dead name and misgender one of your best friends and you don't say anything about it. It's just this, oh, ha 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 moment. And that was very uncomfortable for me. And I wanted to translate with the correct pronouns and with the correct name, but I was specifically instructed by the client to not do that. So there are some cases where they even tell me, hey, if there's something that wouldn't really sit well with American audiences, they'd be a little sensitive about that. You have the liberty to change it. But on the other hand, they do have the final say. And if I do try to change something for the sake of, you know, not offending people, and just also for what I feel is morally more correct, I don't really want to be a part of a project that promotes transphobia, then you run into some slight issues. And yeah, the main reason I was torn is, again, I think there's no problem with there being transphobic characters. I just didn't feel that their transphobic comments or remarks were ever part of the story. They were never advancing the plot. They were always just like a 1 or 2 line like throwaway gag. They were never part of the story. So I didn't feel that they were necessary. And that's really like the main thing that bothered me. It's like, if it were part of the story, then okay, it makes more sense to leave it in. But if it's just, haha, we're gonna make a transphobic joke, like, I don't really like that. So that was my little pronoun talk. I don't really know what else to say. So that was my pronoun talk. As you can see, a lot goes into translating, or the proper term really is localizing. As you can see, a lot goes into localizing anime in games, making sure that everything sounds natural and making sure that the characters' true personalities and motivations and feelings are really transmitted well into English from Japanese. When subtleties like differences in personal pronouns don't exist in English, we have to use the subtleties that we do have in the language, such as word choice, to show these differences. Next time you watch anime, listen closely and see which pronouns people are using, and see if you can notice any subtle differences in the way that their dialogue is translated. Bye!
Oh, hi!
Thanks for watching that video. If you want to support me for free, like, comment, share, subscribe, do all the YouTube stuff. You can also add me on the Facebook or the Twitter. Or you can head over to my Etsy shop where I have Sailor Moon, Ai no Minako, and all sorts of other amigurumi for sale. If you're feeling even more generous, I have a Patreon now. For just $1 or $2 a month, you can get special perks like your name in the credits, or a secret monthly video. Or you could just binge watch all my videos to the end to trick the almighty algorithm into thinking that I'm popular. Do it for the kitties! Bye!